be these days and the things that could change that might allow us to explore our own personal spirituality, whatever we can to make a better country, a better state, and a better opportunity to connect with everyone around us. So I saw it as a tie-in. And we're going to talk today about gross national product, gross domestic product, general progress indicator. These are all things that we normally do not talk about. But at the same time, some of the measurements of these tools are so profound that it really suggests to me that this might be something we could look at as far as an elevation of being in the future. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken. And thank you, Ken, for coming in.
I'm going to pop in with I'm going to pop in with I would like to do your bio and also say I agree that this is the future of humanity. That's why it's relevant, because going towards a higher life for all of humanity and the planet. And I saw you in person a while back, and I always thought, who was that person who had that amazing talk about what seems like the process from another planet? So that I remembered being there with my friend who invited me, and so I'm really looking forward to this tonight. And I didn't realize it until I saw the slides, actually, because I went, oh my God, that's the guy I remember in the back of my mind, sitting in the audience, just being more and more fascinated. So Ken has 35 years as a grassroots organizer and candidate for public office in Minnesota. His interest in ecology and the green movement have led to political and social activism. In 1986, he started working with Greenpeace, and then in 1996, he transitioned to become an all-purpose organizer with Greenpeace of Minnesota. In 2008, he left not Greenpeace, Green Party. My screen went off the side. In 2008, he left the Green Party to invent the nonpartisan, and that's the key here, nonpartisan Ecology Democracy Network. After bicycling over 6,000 miles, woohoo, in Minnesota, doing outreach and education, the mandates of the network took shape. And I could read more, but we sent that out in writing. So I think I will just hand it off to you. I'm so excited you're here, and welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Hope and Michael and everyone, for allowing me to be here today and share with you the discussion around the idea of reversing ecocide on the planet, and the other aspect of that, which is accelerating ecocide, reversing ecological overshoot on the planet. That's the main objective of the Ecology Democracy Network. The Ecology Democracy Network, our goal is basically structural change in the economy, who we pick for our representation, and who influences our governance. And so none of those, the economy, representation, and who influences our government, work in isolation. They all work together for transformation. That's the way the formula. So now, can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody can see that. So this is the logo, and this is where it all begins and ends today. No, I'm kidding. We'll continue on from here. We will continue on. This is not where it begins and ends. It's just a logo. But that's the Ecology Democracy Network. You get the gist of kind of the general framing of where we're going with the discussion. And the network, as I mentioned, seeks structural change in the economy, how we pick our representation, and who influences our government. And I'm just going to move that up there in the corner. Hopefully it makes sense. We want to end in the ecology-based economy, which is one of the main objectives of our discussion today. We want to end the idea of a growth economic model. All of us were born into a system that's basically an open-ended system on a finite resource base, open-ended economic system on a finite resource base. Well, that obviously is not sustainable. So the goal of the network is to start reversing some of the trends that we're facing right now to get towards more of an ecology balance where we grow and decompose based upon the health of our ecology. That's the main objective. There are two main drivers we'll focus on today, but the one that I'll zero in on is the gross domestic product and the genuine progress indicator. The gross domestic product is one of the things we'll talk about that is a driver of ecological overshoot. And I'll mention what I mean about that later. The other driver of overshoot is the idea of interest-bearing debt, or historically known as usury, which is another thing that we want to end on the planet as well. So those are two of the main drivers, the gross domestic product and the idea of usury, which is accelerating this overshoot on Earth. The issue of the idea of reversing ecocide is tied into this overshoot, ecological overshoot. And there are a number of ingredients that go into the formula to reverse this ecocide that we're facing right now. And there's numerous work going on, and my screen is somewhat blocked by the pictures, so I'm not going to be able to read it clearly, but you may be able to see this. Basically, ecocide is the damage and destruction of ecosystems at severe harm to nature and is widespread and long-term. So as many of you know, what ecocide would represent would be, let's say, massive ocean industrial fishing in the oceans, massive discharging of persistent toxic poisons, the emissions of CO2 gases and methane and other greenhouse warming gases into the atmosphere, and on and on and on. We could go. These are all elements of what's considered ecocide. And within that, as I mentioned, we want to end the growth imperative in the existing economy, where we're told we have to grow each quarter in the economy. One of the steps that we want to take in the short term is to establish an immediate planetary jubilee to dissolve all debt on Earth right now. Now, there are examples that are happening around the planet around student debt. There's the International Monetary Fund is talking about their own version of the jubilee. There are many examples of debt being dissolved or resolved on Earth. And this would need to happen at a much more rapid rate and a larger scale. So there's a Jubilee USA, which people can go to. I've generally tried to tie sources to most of this discussion, so it's not just me saying it, into the ether, out of thin air. There are people actually who work on these things and dig deeper than I do on some of this. The things I'm digging deeper on, we'll talk about today. Talked about the idea of ending interest-bearing debt or usury. There are examples of this throughout history, like for example, the Greenback movement. When Lincoln funded the Civil War, he basically printed money directly out of the U.S. Mint at zero interest. So basically bypassing the central bank, which we know as the Fed, right now, the Federal Reserve, and basically printed money directly out of the US Treasury, which holds the US Mint. And that was done at zero interest, very popular. Greenbacks were very popular. And then there's one of the ways to measure our overshoot or living beyond carrying capacity that as a touchstone is the ecological footprint network. Highly recommend people checking that out. And every year, they put out a report around overshoot, the day that we've lived beyond carrying capacity of the Earth to restore itself, to regenerate groundwater, topsoil, habitats, so on and so forth. And this last year, the point in the year that we went beyond carrying capacity was July 29th. So after July 29th, we were living beyond carrying capacity on Earth. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then one of the measures that we'll talk about today more focused is the genuine progress indicator and why that's important to this discussion about reversing overshoot. But it's a ingredient in the formula. So it's not the end all be all, what I'll be talking about today. There's no way we'd have time tonight to discuss all these important efforts on Earth. Then there's also this movement to establish a fifth crime in the International Criminal Court through the Rome Statute, and that would be ecocide. And there's a movement there's a draft proposal that's there moving in that direction. So the Stop Ecocide movement is a good movement. And then, of course, the other pieces of the puzzle is the way we do accounting. And that has to do with the idea of making sure that the prices we're given and the products we purchase start to internalize or express the whole cost of that product, or the true cost, or the life cycle cost of that product, or as Holly Lassen of Adbuster says, the ecological truth in the price of the products we're purchasing. That's another effort on Earth, and I highly recommend Adbusters number 85. That was a great inspiration for me. And then, of course, there's the other movement on Earth called the rights of nature, where nature in and of itself, not unlike ecocide, nature has its own, its own identity, its own place. It's not just there for humans to use and turn into products, basically. Other aspects of change that to get humans together to convene and solve these problems we're facing in relationship to overusing Earth. There are movements around the world to change the way we practice what's known as democracy. Now, democracy for me is a work in progress. There's no absolutes in democracy at this point on Earth, but there are aspects of it that are important. And if you look at like the Sortition Foundation, they're based upon the work of Athenian democracy, the first 200 years of democracy in Athens. They basically did representation by lot, not unlike we pick a jury for a jury trial, random selection of our representation. Because basically the premise is that elections right now are based upon selection by those who can afford to purchase candidates. So sortition is a movement that's growing around the world through models like citizen assemblies, polling, things like that. If we're going to use elections, we propose proportional representation. Used throughout the world in most emerging and established democracies on the planet. You get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats in the House or Senate. It's proportional. And then, of course, there's the idea of approval voting, which is another method of voting. And then there's the work of Move to Amend to reduce the influence of corporations on the planet and basically reduce them to what they initially were, which were temporary agreements to do a project and then dissolve or wait for the next project. But corporations have now transcended governance and have become super powerful. They've become beyond, they're considered persons in the legal sense in the United States, but they've transcended humans in so many ways. And we don't have time to talk about that today. But of course, if you have questions at the end, we can chat about that. But the discussion today is to end ecocide or reverse ecological overshoot. And this is from 2016. So we actually have accelerated overshoot by now, but Ecological Footprint Network says we're now about 70% beyond the ability of natural systems to restore themselves. So it takes about 1.7 planets every year to provide our needs on Earth. And as you can see, it's, overfishing, harvesting, forests, CO2, all these things contribute to living beyond carrying capacity. If, according to the Global Footprint Network, if, if we live the lifestyle of Australia, the United States, we need about 5 planets. There's about 13 countries on Earth that are living well beyond carrying capacity right now that can be identified, isolated. And as you can see, they're mostly there: US, Australia, Western European countries, Japan, Russia, China, so on, Brazil, and so on. Why do I do this? Why do I care? Of course, we all care, but the urgency is growing rapidly. The acceleration, the velocity of activity on Earth has happened so quickly. I mean, we've gone from 1 billion humans on Earth in 1800 to now close to 8 billion people on the planet in a flash. We've gone 100 years from no TV to now an infinite amount of choices to pick from for visuals on screens. And the external stimuli has grown rapidly the last 100 years. And just the general growth has happened in a flash based upon historical time. According to a report in Nature, a century ago, humans occupied basically 15% of the Earth's surface. We now occupy close to 80% of the Earth's surface, and the 87% of the oceans have been modified by US activity or by human activity. And so we're just growing rapidly, using things rapidly. Most of the land use is tied to agriculture, about 50% of it, corn, soybeans for industrial feedlots and so on. And a lot of this growth in a flash has happened in the modern day of oil since about 1850. We've just grown rapidly. And I think part of the awareness we have is winning. We're aware of the condition, and part of it, we're just completely unaware of the condition. It's happening at such a flash, at such a rate, we can't keep up with it. And a lot of it, the rate is happening at such a quick rate that we're basically now handing over kind of a lot of our activity to our machines, our computers, and so on. One of the things I wanted to bring up, I wanted to do here was go to let's see here.
Do you want the YouTube? I do have that.
Yeah, I wanted to queue up that YouTube. I do have it here too. Hang on. I think I put that up here. Let's see here. I just wanted to queue up one of the things I wanted to talk about in this velocity of growth. It's tied to the idea of interest-bearing debt, and I'm hoping this works. There we go. And so this is a short 2 minutes of Charles Eisenstein talking about money in the economy. It's out of a book, highly recommend the book, called Sacred Economics. And so here, I'm just going to play this little 2-minute excerpt.
Well, money's an agreement. It doesn't have value all by itself. It has value because people agree that it has value. Economists will tell you what money does. It facilitates exchange. You use it to count things and keep track of things. You write some numbers on a magical piece of paper called a check, and you can cause all kinds of abundant goods to come to your house. I mean, you could even cause misery for thousands of people if you are one of the highest initiates of the magic of money. Scarcity is built into the money system. On the most obvious level, it's because of the way money is created as interest-bearing debt. So anytime a bank lends money into existence, or the Federal Reserve creates money, the money comes along with a corresponding amount of debt. And the debt, because there's interest on it, is always greater than the amount of money. So it essentially throws people into competition with each other for never enough money. Growth is another thing that's built into our money system. If you're a bank, you're going to lend to the person who's going to create new goods and services. so they can profit and they can pay you back. You're not going to lend to somebody who doesn't create goods and services. So money goes toward those who will create even more of it. But basically, economic growth means that you have to find something that was once nature and make it into a good, or was once a gift relationship and make it into a service. You have to find something that people once got for free, or did for themselves or for each other, and then take it away and sell it back to them somehow. By turning things into commodities, we get cut off from nature in the same ways we're cut off from community. We look at nature with eyes of it's just a bunch of stuff. And that leaves us very lonely and leaves us with many basic human needs that go unmet. And if you have money, you might try to fulfill this hunger through purchasing, through buying things, or through accumulating money itself. And of course, now we're nearing the end of growth. The planet can't sustain much more growth. And that's why the crisis that we have today won't go away.
I think, really well-spoken way of articulating one of the concerns that the network has, the Ecology Democracy Network, and many people on Earth have right now, is that interest on debt is driving us into a very dangerous place. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring that up. And I wanted to go back to my slideshow and go back to where we were there. And so one of the things, this is a chart from the General Accounting Office, for example. And if everyone can see it, basically what it is it shows the net interest spending by the US government, the debt that the US government owes. Now, this is not personal debt. There's trillions in personal debt, mortgages, cars, student loans. This is just the US government debt. And right now, around 2017, we're moving in, they broke it down into these years. We're about $263 billion. We were just paying interest on debt in the US government. Most of it, about 95% of it, is private debt that we owe to the Federal Reserve, basically, which is made up of basically private banks. And that takes about 6.6% of our economy. But as that interest compounds over time, you can see the amount of dollars and the amount at the bottom of the US spending, our government spending, which will be accorded to this interest on debt. And so we go from $263 billion a year just paying interest on debt. And if you go to 2091, it goes up to about 75 trillion, just interest on debt, which will take up close to 41% of the US economy. And this is from the General Accounting Office, 2018. So things may have changed or adjusted since then. But $75 trillion, we're going to need a number of planets to pay off just the interest on debt alone. And this does not include other tricks that the financial sector uses to inflate the economy, such as derivatives. And derivatives are basically repackaged debt and edited and repackaged. And it's like future bets. It's bets on the future, paying off based upon specific pricing. And that's over $100 trillion right now, just derivatives. So the interest on debt, financial packaging, all of these things are driving us to use up more and more of the earth to pay off all this interest. And it's not physically, mathematically possible. And it's super dangerous right now. So that's why we want to end this idea of the monetary system of usury or interest-bearing debt. That's one of the big things. And of course, we'll talk about later in the genuine progress indicator, a great deal of the financial sector would be erased because it's of no value. So let's go to now talking about how we measure the economy. And that is what I wanted to talk about tonight. And at this time, the most powerful measurement on earth is the gross domestic product. And it was basically, it started as a small measure back in 1934. The US Congress and the president at that time, Roosevelt, directed a team of people to come up with what was known as aggregate of national income, which basically became the gross national product, which was generally became the gross domestic product over time. And at that time in 1934, it was generally a minor measurement to just test out the aggregate economic activity of the United States. And it was supposed to be a Depression era, wartime era measurement. It got carried over, and at Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where the Allied nations got together in New Hampshire. At that time, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and trade agreements were established. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to measure nation by nation's economic robustness or health based upon the gross domestic product, basically. And the gross domestic product started to grow in more and more importance. And gross domestic product sets pricing, interest rates, and budgeting. And if we go 2 negative quarters of GDP in the US, it's a benchmark for recession. So what's baked into the gross domestic product is that it's a growth imperative. If we do not grow, and everybody will hear this, we need to grow 2%, 3%. Wow, we grew 6%. You'll hear this in the newspapers, on the news. It's always, we're cheerleading for it. And once again, I give deference to the fact that we're caught up in a momentum that part of it we have no control over. And we can talk more about this later. Part of what's going on Earth is unwitting behavior by our species. Okay, so I'm not sitting here as speaking in absolute terms, but there is witting behavior as well. So, but if, once again, if we just think about 3% a year, if the economy grows 3% a year, we have to double it every 24 years. It's just not physically, mathematically possible on Earth to keep doing this anymore. And the gross domestic product, while it does show basically a monetary footprint within a domestic economy, there's different ways of defining it, and it does have that value. So I don't want to say the gross domestic product should be eliminated. I'm saying that gross domestic product should no longer be the dominant economic signal that nation states on Earth chase. And around 200 nation states calculate their national economies using the gross domestic product. And and so that is one of the reasons it's important to talk about this. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we need to understand is that when people go into a store and they buy a product or go online and buy a product, to see the price of something, that price is predicated on the gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product is a gross number. It's not a net number. So when people buy something at the store, they see the price of it, but they don't see the cost of that product. So you can buy a gallon of gasoline. Yes, the price is $3.20 a gallon, but the cost of emphysema and asthma and bronchitis and cancer is not in that gallon of gasoline. It's not in the price of that product, because the way the accounting is done in gross domestic product is not accurately reflected in prices. Another example would be like in Minnesota, for example. Every year in November and February, the state of Minnesota, through the state economist, does a state forecast. That state forecast is predicated on the gross state product, which is synonymous with the gross domestic product. That state forecast is what the governor uses to shape his budget. That budget is what committee members use to set their what they use as targets or what they can spend on policy in committee. So when people are talking about how this affects them directly, this is a direct visceral effect in our daily lives. If we're buying something, if we're getting policy that affects us in a day-to-day way through government regulation or government incentives or government investments, that all shows up because of the way we calculate using the gross domestic product. So it's very powerful, it's very personal, but it also is very abstract. It's all these things at once. And it should not be taken lightly. So that's why I wanted to focus on it, because it's a macroeconomic signal that reaches globally. Now I wanted to play a little piece here by Robert Kennedy. And so this is not new news. What I'll be talking about today is old news, okay? It's, well, you know, the Simon Kuznets, who helped develop the gross domestic product back in 1934, had similar critiques as what you're going to hear. This is 2 minutes of Robert Kennedy at Kansas University. Hopefully this will work, Hope. I'm just going to click on the link. Let's.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community value in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are American.
We're back to, there we go. So this particular statement, 2 minutes of what I call economic poetry by Robert Kennedy. I want to give a little aside on this because it was a thrill for me this last year. I dug around for like 3 years. Who wrote this? Who gave them the ideas behind this thoughts behind the gross national product at the time? And I did some investigation, and I finally was reading a book, and it was a woman named Hazel Henderson. She's a renowned kind of, I don't know how to put it. She runs an organization called Ethical Markets. She's a woman who's been around many years, who's been working on ecological, economic issues, many other social policies on a variety of levels. And she was working on air quality issues in New York in 1967. And she was able to get on a plane ride with Robert Kennedy and describe to him the deficiency of the gross national product. And a year later, this piece showed up in his speech. And this last year, I sent an email randomly to Hazel Henderson, and she responded, and she was just giddy about the genuine progress indicator. So it was like a, wow, very exciting moment to connect with somebody who really, I think, helped shape a lot of important thinking that went into this 2 minutes of Robert Kennedy's speech. And so there were numerous deficiencies identified in the gross domestic product over the last 80 years. And in 1995, an alternative economic measure emerged called the Genuine Progress Indicator. And Minnesota actually had a roundtable in the late 1990s and put together a report through the Department of Planning called Smart Signals. And in that report, they recommended Minnesota move away from using the gross state product or gross domestic product and start using the Genuine Progress Indicator. And they actually did a Genuine Progress Indicator for the state of Minnesota as an alternative to the gross domestic product. And so this has got a long history, and I'm just basically picking up a dusty report, and that's why I'm here today. I've learned from it since I picked it up about 10 years ago. And since then, in 2010, Maryland passed the Genuine Progress Indicator into law. Vermont then passed it, Washington, Hawaii. They used it in a cursory way, not in a visceral way like we'd like to see, but 20 states have calculated statewide GPIs, and over 30 countries have done national GPIs and across all ideological boundaries. So it's not an ideological discussion, it's a discussion about accurate accounting. And I believe about 8 Southeast Asian countries right now are finishing up doing Genuine Progress Indicators as we speak. But it's considered the most scientifically vetted alternative to the gross domestic product on Earth right now, the Genuine Progress Indicator. And the initial Genuine Progress Indicator was based upon a triple bottom line measurement. And so it has economic, social, and environmental indicators in it. Now, generally the Genuine Progress Indicator is a social welfare indicator. That's what it is. And it is considered weak sustainability because it takes into account human welfare. That's the gist of it. So it's not a measure of sustainability, but it includes sustainability, and it's a very holistic measurement in that respect. So that's why I'm attracted to this measurement, because it's holistic, you know, it's well vetted, and it meets the scale of the problem we're facing on Earth right now. And that's really key. And then you'll see in here a number of indicators that are tied to this measure. We won't be able to go through all of them, and I can send you numerous sources for this, and you can go online and find it as well, and links. But it generally deals with where the gross domestic product, right in the title, says gross. It's a gross number. The Genuine Progress Indicator basically is a net number. It subtracts. It's not just addition, which is what the GDP is. It subtracts. So it's a net number. And that's the difference between, basically we're going from single entry bookkeeping with GDP to double entry bookkeeping with the Genuine Progress Indicator. That's the gist of it. Hopefully that makes sense as I describe that. And this is then what happened is that there's about 50 plus people around the world who are constantly trying to improve the Genuine Progress Indicator. So in Maryland, they implemented what's known as GPI 2.0, and a report came out in 2017 that articulates this. I can send it to anyone who's interested. But this is basically taking what I showed before, those 3 columns, and increasing some of the indicators and changing some of the way things are measured. So there's been adjustments made along the way. It's constantly being adapted to the conditions we're facing on Earth, basically. But you'll see a number of things on here. And I'll give some clarifying examples of these measures as well. And but let's just talk through a couple of, I want to walk through some of this a little bit, and these are examples that I give fairly regularly, but I think they're clarifying examples of the difference between the gross domestic product and the Genuine Progress Indicator. Would that work for you? Okay. So in this discussion, let's just start out with the ecological indicators, which overlap. Like I say, it's interconnected. There's a lot of moving parts here. There's no way we'll have time. I could talk for 10 hours, you guys, about this. So let's just talk about the Minnesota River Valley. Okay, some of you may be familiar with the Minnesota River Valley. It runs from the western part of the state to the eastern part of the state. It hooks up south of the Twin Cities to the Mississippi River. And for the last 80 years, the gross domestic product said grow. Hello, is there somebody there? Oh, the gross domestic product said grow food for volume in the watershed. And we did. We grew a lot of food in the Minnesota River watershed. But there's no indicator in the measurement that says this groundwater cannot replenish itself. This topsoil cannot replenish itself. In the genuine progress indicator, probably late 1960s or early 1970s, it would have said, whoa, slow down or stop, because this practice of growing food is now costing us, because this watershed cannot replenish itself. So where the GDP does not recognize limits, the genuine progress indicator does. Did that make sense? Does that make sense? Okay, good. I'm taking your nod, Hope, as a yes. I'm using you as my point of reference at this point. And then let's take it a step further. You'll see in the late 60s, early 70s, we started to realize, oh my God, we're creating havoc on the planet. There's a lot of ecological deterioration going on. Rachel Carson wrote a book, Silent Spring. There was the Cuyahoga River was on fire. There was a lot of indicators that things were starting to get out of balance with our ecology. And so we started to invest in things like, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Environmental Pollution Protection Agency, the Clean Water, the Clean Air, the Endangered Species Act, many other governmental activities and remediation that was done at the time to manage the overuse of these watersheds and these habitats and the deterioration of species on Earth. In the gross domestic product, it only recognizes money exchanges. So all the time that committees had to analyze the condition, all the time we did in the field to monitor and permit and filter and deal with health effects, all that economic activity in the gross domestic product shows up as a credit on the national spreadsheet, as a good, as a positive, because it just shows money exchanges. It doesn't care about value. In the genuine progress indicator, those expenditures will be considered defensive expenditures, money we spend to protect ourselves or save our lives. And those would be considered a cost, not a credit on the spreadsheet. And when you shift from a credit to a cost on the spreadsheet, you change incentive and you change behavior. So now in the Minnesota River watershed, instead of seeing all the remediation showing up as a credit, it would be showing up as a cost, which would change incentive, which would change behavior. Now it becomes less attractive to overuse the watershed and far more attractive to invest in more restorative, regenerative agricultural practices. Did that make sense, what I just described? Now that is an issue of, an example of ecology and biodiversity and all these things that are now being included in the genuine progress indicator. So that's one example of the difference between the two measurements. And you could take that example and it's endemic in electricity, it's endemic in transportation, in land use planning, in other areas of solid waste. You can apply this type of a discussion in those other sectors as well. Now let's talk about another area of discussion. This is social indicators. And let's take somebody who wakes up in Otter Tail County up north near Fergus Falls. They wake up at 5:30 in the morning. They tend to the animals, the kids, the cleaning, the cooking, the mending till 9 at night. for 40 years. In the gross domestic product, that activity does not show up because no money has been exchanged. In the genuine progress indicator, we'd put a column in the state or the national or the global spreadsheet that would value household work, because somebody who takes care of a home using the GDP at this point de facto is subsidizing those that are in the workplace. And somebody who takes care of a home is extremely valuable to the cohesiveness of the family, community, society in general. It's essential work on Earth. Now, according to the United Nations, about 53% of the world's work is household work right now. And women are doing about 60 to 70% of the world's work right now on Earth. Much of that is this non-monetized activity around household maintenance, household care, household economics, however you want to define it. And this could also be endemic around volunteerism as well. Volunteerism doesn't show up on the GDP spreadsheet. In the genuine progress indicator, it would be valued because volunteerism is valuable to our society. So these are a couple of examples of the difference between the two measures. And like I say, we could take this and keep the discussion going on and on and on about what this means to our society, what this means to policymakers when they walk into a committee and recognize that there's now a column in their spreadsheet that values household work. Now a policymaker can see a more accurate picture of what real economic activity is taking place in our society, and then maybe start setting up a social pension for those who take care of a home. And that's another example of the difference between the two. And I'll give one more example in the economic categories, because like I say, you can go on for hours about this. But in the economic categories, let's just take Hennepin County, for example. Right now, in the GDP, one person could gain all the benefits of productivity in Hennepin County, and the GDP could improve because it doesn't care about allocation of resources. In the genuine progress indicator, it uses what's known as marginal utility. And so that would mean basically $1,000 going to somebody who makes $40,000 a year has a different value than $1,000 going to somebody who makes $1 million a year. So where the GDP does not care about income inequality, the genuine progress indicator does. And as you know, income inequality is an indicator throughout all societies of the stability of those societies. So we can talk more about that at a later time as well. Was that clear what I just described? That makes sense? Thanks, Hope. I'm going with your nods. Those are a few examples of an example in each indicator, just in each category, to give you an idea of the difference between the two measures and why it's so important to accurately account for activity in society that actually increases or depletes value. One other thing that I did want to bring up and that I think is important is the issue of migration in relationship to the way we measure the economy. So 80 years ago in Minnesota, and this could be endemic within any state in the country and anywhere in the world. So it's not exclusive to Minnesota, okay? But in Minnesota, about 80 years ago, 52% of the Minnesota population lived in rural areas. That's now down to about 17%. And according to the state demographer, that trend is going to continue for the next 40 years. So we're going to add about 1 million people to the metro region over the next 40 years. And evidence towards that would be the last census. And you'll see in the last census that took place last year, the biggest increase in population is Hennepin County. Okay, so it's the most populous county and it's the one that increased the most. And so we're seeing this pull from rural to urban over the last 80 years. What was I going to say? So that to me is something that needs to be discussed, because what we're looking at is, it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons we see this pull from rural to urban is the way we measure the economy. Why is that? Because let's just take metro regions, and let's just mention, we're adding 1 million people a week, or excuse me, 2 million people a week on Earth to cities on the planet. So we're seeing many cities, many of you had evidence and you can look it up to see the explosion of major cities on the planet. Shanghai, Beijing, Mexico City, Tokyo, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, St. Paul, so on and so forth. And it's, like I said, not the only reason, but it's a critical component to what's pulling people from rural to urban. And why is that? Because what triggers the gross domestic product? It's monetary exchanges. And if you have a dense population in a geographic area, and they require massive external resources for survival, like cities and suburbs do, they're paying money for energy, food, transportation. That triggers the GDP. That's the GDP then says that's where the value and investment is in our society. In rural areas, people are doing much activities that are based a lot more, let's say, on self-reliance or self-sufficiency, longer distances, doing valuable activity, but not valued in the way we measure the economy. So what we've seen is, we try to do patchwork on the government level, local government aid, bonding, payment in lieu of taxes. I'm not against any of that, but it has nothing to do with the scale of the problem we're facing based upon the gross domestic product. And so what we're seeing is this extreme pull from rural to urban, and no way do people in many rural areas want to contaminate their water, but they want their children to live there. They want their health clinics. They want their libraries. They want housing. And so, no, they don't want to poison their water. But if Polymet dangles $650 million in front of a stressed rural community, they're going to be given bad choices. And a lot of people are going to say, I want my kids to live here. I'm willing to take the money, because that's the only way we're going to be able to invest in maintaining the community and creating jobs in the region. So it doesn't necessarily lead to very good choices for a lot of people, the way we're measuring the economy right now. The genuine progress indicator would reverse this trend. It would lead to localism, reducing stress and tension on a local level, reducing the need for migration, stabilizing the economy where people live. That's one of the outcomes of the genuine progress indicator. And I can go on and on and on. Of course, ask me questions if you like, of examples of why this would happen. But I'm not going to go into all that detail at this point. But I will tell you that is one of the outcomes of, and as I showed the examples in the Minnesota River watershed, what happened? It led towards more localism in the way we tend to the watershed using the genuine progress indicator. Restorative regenerative agriculture reduces the need for external inputs, so on and so forth, like other inputs like hormones and antibiotics and pesticides and herbicides and fertilizers and so on. It reduces all of that external input. When we're talking about social value, somebody taking care of a home, that's very local. That's very something we invest in on a local level, maintaining less stress, less tension where people live, reducing the need to migrate, things like that. Income inequality, same thing. We talked about that. Would stabilize the population, reduce the stress and tension that forces people in desperation to have to leave one region to go to another. So these are the types of, I'm giving you cursory examples, but just enough to give you a taste of what we're talking about here. And this is a chart of what I tried to express to you earlier. You'll see in this chart, this is from Vermont, but this is endemic within the US and other states in the country and around the world. Around the late 60s, early 70s, the gross state product, which is the gross domestic product, deviates from the genuine progress indicator. Genuine progress indicator, there's about a 43% difference in this particular example from Vermont. And that deviation is consistent, for example, when you look at the ecological footprint network. When did humans start living beyond carrying capacity on Earth? It was around that same time, 1968. When did, there are other examples that can be assigned to this discussion as well. But the important thing is that a lot of the difference between the gross state product and the genuine progress indicator is tied to the idea of overproduction. Right now in the gross domestic product, we reward massive overproduction in most sectors. The genuine progress indicator would recognize that as a hollow value and no longer see it as a good measure in the economy, overproduction. The other thing is the idea of fluff, like I mentioned earlier, in the financial sector. A lot of economic activity is based upon hollow value. But in the gross domestic product, a day trader with the financial sector can sit in front of a computer. Their algorithm can trade frantically all day, trading basically on other people's work and re-editing and repackaging debt over and over again. And all those trades shows up as monetary trades, and the gross domestic product sees that as value and says, good, the economy is improving. When in fact, it's based upon false measures. And the genuine progress indicator recognizes a lot of that activity as not valuable. So there's a gap. These are that's a couple of examples of why that gap is so big. Overproduction
and for myself, I've been on the treadmill working hard most of my life. It's been a toughie. But I started thinking about it. I'm going, okay, so now I'm buying a house, but I don't have compound interest tripling, quadrupling, 5 times the cost of that home. I can work on paying that off. My water's much cleaner. My food's much cleaner. We're being valued on the children being able to produce good grades, happiness. And one of the things I thought was fascinating was Bhutan's model of gross national happiness. And I think these are fascinating concepts. The way we're going now just makes me feel like competition really is an ends to its own means. And maybe we end up at one point with the greatest psychopath in the world who runs everything. I don't know, but it's a pretty scary world right now.
Well, we are testing extremes. You're right. I mean, we are testing extremes. We don't know exactly. Once again, people could make mistakes 500, 5,000 years ago. But now, and where we live now, the margin of error is so much narrower than it was then in relationship to the biosphere. And since we are a subspecies in a larger biosphere, what we do to the larger biosphere affects all subspecies. So the more we heat up the atmosphere and the oceans, the more that we deteriorate water quality and extinction of species, this is creating stress on all subspecies, including us. And how that plays out, we're not sure exactly. We are an amazing, I don't want to dismiss all the goodness and the love and the care among our cultures and societies. So I don't want to take away from that. But on scale, we are deteriorating our condition rapidly and creating conditions that in many respects we can't recover from. So what the genuine progress indicator, the way I see it right now, is ultimately what we're trying to do is just cushion a collapse that's inevitable. Because we're kind of like, since we found oil, we've been like a balloon, and we've been filling up that balloon with stuff, and we just overextended and we live well beyond carrying capacity, massive overproduction. And now that we've come to the last of oil, nothing can replace it. No renewables can replace the oil. I mean, a barrel of oil does the work of 500 people, all right? Solar, wind, none of that, it's all a myth to think that we can replace ancient sunlight with all of our modern day techno advancement. It's not physically, mathematically possible. Most people can look into this if they want. So we're going to have to come down, either we come down, try to bring it down out of choice in a calm and thoughtful way, or we can wait till real severe conditions force us to change. This is not unusual throughout history. Empires have risen and fallen. They've learned and created great wisdom out of these crashes, throughout history. But unfortunately, we're now at a point where the margin of error in relationship to the biosphere is far more narrow than anything we've known throughout history. And so that is what the concern is right now from my point of view. And that's why I'm doing this. And one of the things I wanted to mention before we get to, there are a couple bills that I've been able to get introduced at the state level. We've got a bill in the House, Representative Schultz and Senator Fateh have a bill in the House and Senate that would offer up a alternative spreadsheet for the state of Minnesota. It would be a side-by-side with the gross domestic or gross state product. So it'd be an annual spreadsheet that policymakers would get when they go into committee. Governor would receive it. Everybody would have a different economic picture painted for them using the genuine progress indicator accounting. The same thing is on the federal level. We were able to get a bill introduced, House Resolution 4894, Genuine Progress Indicator Act of 2021. Also, it would work through federal agencies, and it would be analyzed by the Bureau of Economic Analysis on an annual basis about its value to policymakers, its utility, and the development of the GPI in general. So these are bills that people can rally behind if they want to, if they have an organization or a group or an individual and they want to start mobilizing people to support these bills. These are options available to you that are literal tools that are introduced now in Congress or in the State House. So just to let you know, this is not just a pie in the sky discussion. There is something that we can, there's a wagon we can be hooked to in this one. And so I think that's it on my slideshow. So why don't we go to questions, thoughts, ideas?
Well, one of the concepts I had, and it's more of an intuitive feel, that moving towards a genuine progress indicator is more of a heart-based model of living versus a what we call GDP. We would call that it's more cold, I guess. So in the genuine progress indicator, I see the values for stay-at-home families. I see values for having a smaller footprint of carbon and other things that we really don't need, and going more towards helping people versus me trying to sell you something to make a buck for the next thing I need. I don't know where it all goes, Ken. I just know that we need to head in some that direction, because I agree that our economy is not sustainable as it is. And I think we're seeing that right now when you're talking 9 trillion in seed money through the world and we have 130 trillion in debt. There's no way to pay it back, but we're going to keep printing it up on this fiat system that, again, is kind of working a little bit right now because we're allowing it to, but there's going to be a cost. There's going to be a stop to it at a point in time. It's pretty scary.
Yeah, and once again, I mean, the United States, I don't know how we're going to play out. Since I've been born, we've been about 5% of the world's population consuming 25 to 30% of the world's resources. And that that dependency cannot continue. Obviously, we have limits to the biosphere. So how do we react in a way that's thoughtful rather than crazy? And where we see, things start popping off and, we start losing control of our ability to maintain some social stability. And that's a real trick right now. I mean, there's no easy answer to that. And like I said, the discussion around the way we measure an economy is not exclusive from how we govern the economy or govern our societies. That's interconnected. They're not isolated. And so that has to be discussed as well, how they work together. And so I think that what we have here is that we have a way to, this is not, I get support from people across the ideological spectrum on this discussion. People that want less government taxes regulation, people that want sustainability. It's not an ideological discussion. It's about a discussion about living within our means on a limited biosphere. And that's the gist of what this is about. It's about, like you mentioned, Michael, the genuine, where the GDP, you could work 365 days a year nonstop and the GDP would say, good, Michael, keep working. If you can work 366 days a year, please do it, because it just cares about volume. It's just a volume-based measurement. So it keeps cheering people on to keep extracting and keep working and extracting and working and extracting without limits. And what the genuine progress indicator does is it puts a measure in there that says, we value leisure time. The economy will improve when people are getting time off. A new indicator, a new measure starts to reduce the stress and the tension in people's lives. Value is now put into the way we measure the economy that recognizes we need time for contemplation, for creativity, for friendships, for family. We need time off. And a lot of the dominant economy, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of our time is spent managing overproduction in the economy, and the GDP says good. If you just look at transportation, in the GDP, a car crash is good because now you got to bring in an emergency vehicle. It's spending money on that. You got to hustle somebody to the hospital. You got to fix a car, got to repair a road. All that's money being spent. The GDP says, yeah, that's good. That's a positive. In the genuine progress indicator, a car crash would be a cost. All those expenditures would be considered defensive expenditures. Auto insurance would be considered a defensive expenditure. Right now, auto insurance is considered a good, a credit in the way we measure the macroeconomy. And it shows up in all of our pricing, all of our budgeting, all of our interest rates. And so it's dysfunctional the way we're measuring the economy. If you shift from showing those car crash items as a credit to a cost, now it becomes less attractive to build for sprawl, which is massive overproduction. And it starts far more attractive to plan cities for walkability. Bicycles, buses, trains, far more human scale, localized, reduce the cost of living, increase more time in our lives for friends, family, social, creative, contemplative time. But instead, a lot of our time is just consumed by overproduction. Probably 40 to 60% of everything around us in most every sector is overproduction. Never needed to be made in the first place. Now we can do job sharing. So instead of working 40 or 50 or 60 hours a week, now we create the incentives lead towards people maybe working 25, 30 hours a week, which was supposedly the vision 100 years ago in the economy. More efficiency would lead to more time, less hours worked. The opposite has occurred. In a growth economic imperative, Jevons paradox kicks in. And Jevons paradox says, wherever you create an efficiency is now space for more growth. Okay? So in a growth model, efficiency does not lead to savings. It leads to making more stuff. So if you make cars more efficient, energy, miles per gallon, now that rationalizes people saying, no, I can afford now to drive more miles. And that has proven to be true over the last 50 years. And this is endemic within everything. So using the word efficiency in a growth imperative, in a growth economic model, acts as the inverse of efficiency. It just creates space for more stuff to be made and created. This is the highly dysfunctional deception that's baked right into the way we talk about our economy. Energy efficiency does not save energy. It just rationalizes more space to use more energy. And this is I can go on and on about that. I mean, we could talk for days about that. But the gist is, if we don't change the measure, we can't change the outcome. You don't change a structure, you're never going to change the outcome. And this does not mean there aren't good people, caring people, loving people who are plugged into dysfunctional systems. There are many. It's not about individuals being bad. But ultimately, what we're trying to do here with this discussion is deal with these problems before we cut, before we drill, before we dig. We don't want to wait till it's coming at to us after the fact. Once it's handed to the consumer, the party's over. When you're telling people they got to carry a bag to the store or ride their bicycle or, put in a compact fluorescent light bulb, party's over. We can't solve it. You can't make the consumer solve dysfunctional design, engineering, and manufacturing. But we do. That's the trick of modern day public relations and marketing that's hired by major industries who don't want to pay for their garbage and for their inefficiencies and their dysfunctional planning. Once again, part of this is happening wittingly, part of this is happening unwittingly. So I don't want to make this an absolute, like, all bad people,
No, I get it. I always say I have to buy 3 tree trimmers a year. It seems like they can make a higher quality one. It's like by having poor quality or quality control, they can actually stimulate the economy because you need more of it to do what could have been done if you had a good tool in the first place.
Yeah, no, good point. And I know if anyone has questions, please chime in. I can talk all day about this, so I got to stop me. But I did want to talk about the garbage discussion real quick, just as an example of the difference between the two measures. In the GDP, you can buy and throw away 10 bottles today. Plastic bottles, buy, throw away, buy, throw away, buy, throw away. GDP improves. Because you're purchasing, you're spending money to buy bottles, and you have to go extract oil, and you have to use the polymers and the chlorine to make the bottle, and it's all money being spent, and all the external stuff, a lot of it's just not in the bottom line, so we dump that on the future, like the byproducts of the oil industry and the CO2 and the uranium or whatever. A lot of this stuff's not even on a spreadsheet anywhere on Earth. It's just dumped into the future. So that's where the genuine progress indicator starts to capture some of these external costs that are not in the bottom line. But also, if you think about garbage, back in the late 60s, that's when Coca-Cola, Pepsi, the bottling manufacturers started to realize, oh my God, we have a problem. We've got garbage, and we don't want to manage it. So what did they do? They basically pawned it off on the counties. They handed it over to the government. They externalized garbage to the government. And the counties then had to set up committees and site analysis and monitoring and permitting of landfills and incinerators. All of that showing up as a credit, as a good on the GDP spreadsheet. And then we had, then you had the leakage, and you had to do remediation and filtering and so on and so forth. All of that showing up as a credit. In the genuine progress indicator, it recognizes the difference between disposability and durability. So all those costs associated with monitoring and permitting and managing and cleaning up and health effects, all those are considered defensive expenditures. In the GDP, they show up as a credit. On the genuine progress indicator, they shift from a credit to a cost on the spreadsheet. When you shift from a credit to a cost, you change incentive and you change behavior. Now it becomes less attractive to invest in disposability and planned obsolescence. And it becomes far more attractive to invest in durability and repairability in our systems. And that leads to localism, because now you don't have to go online and go to stores and get stuff sent over from overseas if you have a durable product. If you have a repairable product, it usually happens on a local level. Somebody in a repair unit somewhere in your community handles lawnmowers or vacuums or whatever you're repairing. And so this is a difference between the two measures. And so what did we end up having this last year? I mean, you know, and this attracts ideological, it crosses a spectrum, because those that want less government taxes and regulation naturally would be attracted to durability, because this brings the cost of living down. Because right now we pay well over 10 times in taxes to manage garbage, but it all shows up as a credit on the GDP spreadsheet. And people that want sustainability should never accept the idea of a growth economic model. They should be talking about steady state, ending the growth imperative. But instead, we got a lot of environmental movements and a lot of people that I worked with who I care about and are trying to do the right thing, endorsing and supporting system, you know, trying to do patchwork within the existing structure. You know, put in renewables, try to show a model, show a sample, an example of living right on Earth. I'm not against any of that, but it has nothing to do with meeting the scale of the problem we're facing in 2021 at a velocity we can't manage right now. And the Genuine Progress Indicator attempts to capture this overshoot, bring us towards steady state on scale. So did that make sense, what I just described?
It does.
And that's just because, you know, east of the Mississippi, I think the largest human monument is the Fresh Kills landfill on Long Island.
Does anyone else have questions?
Thoughts, ideas?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Sure.
When you're talking about quality, usually a quality product costs more than the cheaper one.
Right.
And then, and I notice a lot of people around me talking, there's people in the neighborhood that, you know, they're having such financial crisis now that they go to the dollar store to buy their groceries. It's really, you know, that's all they can afford right now. So how do you, somehow this is all got to play into helping people be able to afford that quality too. So how does it play into, if you're not, and a lot of them get those jobs where they're just producing lots of stuff we don't need, you know, it's almost like that was created. We create that stuff to create the jobs, if that makes any sense. Does my
Yes.
question kind of make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And how do we to shift, because it's not just shifting politicians, it's shifting the entire society to change a way of thinking, which,
Right.
like you said, there's a few billion people around to try and convince. You know, so I will.
Well, I
leave it
mean,
to-
there's a number of cross currents in this discussion. So when we talk about the idea of going from disposability to durability, what happens is the cost of living starts coming down. So in a general sense, less stress and less tension on those that are on the margins already to try to keep up with the existing system. Then at the same time, what happens is we start planning, like I mentioned in transportation, another sector where the cost of living comes down, localizing basic needs becomes an outcome of the Genuine Progress Indicator on scale. That's the key. So, and I can talk about energy dollars. Right now, Minnesota exports about $13 to $15 billion for coal, oil, uranium, gas, and big hydro. We bring these fuels into the state, we manage them, all the management, remediation, and waste and stuff all shows up as a credit in the GDP, in the Genuine Progress Indicator. Much of it would be a cost. When you shift from a credit to a cost, now it becomes less attractive to send billions of dollars out of our region, far more attractive to localize those dollars in localized, efficient, renewable type planning within the limits of the biosphere. So these are the types of on scale reactions that the genuine progress indicator would make. So now our activity and our investments would lead towards people who are on the margins, especially, to having less stress, less tension on trying to keep up with wasteful systems. And two, the types of economic activity would change the amount of hours, for example, we need to work to provide our basic needs on Earth. And so, and then also, this also ties into population as well. Because if you look on Earth, and you can, there are hundreds of studies on Earth about this, but when you have, women have housing, healthcare, and education on Earth, we see all over the planet, population stabilizes. Because women get access to healthcare, housing, basic needs or basic human needs are provided. And right now, a lot of women's work on Earth is not valued the way we measure the economy on the planet. Marilyn Waring, Professor Marilyn Waring, wrote a book in 1985 called If Women Counted. Marilyn Waring was the first woman, youngest person elected to the New Zealand Parliament in 1974, I believe it was. And then she started to do this exact discussion we've been having tonight. She's been doing it since the early 70s. And she wrote a book, If Women Counted, a classic. And there's many other examples of this, but it basically recognized that most of the world's work is done by women, not valued the way we measure the economy. It's invisible. Once you start making it visible, now you can value it. Now you can plan for stabilizing communities around the world, Minnesota and so on, by investing in women for the work they're actually doing on the planet. Because right now, a lot of it's just not acknowledged. And now once you start putting up that social pension in general, now housing, healthcare, and education become far more viable, and we see population stabilization occur around the Earth. Did that make sense, what I described? So this is the type of discussions, like I said, there's a lot of moving parts here. So I don't want to say any one of these are easy. And remember, when I talk about the genuine progress indicator and implementing it, the most powerful interests on Earth will hate it. The military, the defensive expenditure of the military shows up as a credit on the US spreadsheet, okay? Needless to say, do we need to go into details about the problems there in that type of calculation? All the major sectors, energy, agriculture, transportation, shipping, all of these industries would be at risk in the level and scale they're doing activity now if we implemented the genuine progress indicator. The financial sector, same thing. The digital sector, same thing. So there are powerful interests on Earth who will never want to see the genuine progress indicator ever apply. But there is a convergence on Earth taking place called beyond GDP, and it's going to eventually happen through the United Nations. And there are numerous examples similar to the GPI that are emerging on the planet. And some of them were mentioned, like the donut economy by Kate Raworth, or there's the gross national happiness index that Michael mentioned. There's the circular type economy. Not all of these are going to be steady state, but they do kind of get you where you're going. And many, many other examples of people trying to converge ecocide, the International Criminal Court, laws of nature. All of these things are attracting many people around the world now that are converging, because the pressure on Earth, with a growing population and a shrinking planet, the velocity increases on Earth of our activity, the pressure grows, and we will become far more acute in our actions in relationship to reversing ecological overshoot. It may not be pretty, it could be fairly ugly, but it's going to come to a head at some point. We've seen this over territorial control the last 100 years, especially, but now it's going to be even more acute.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be too pretty, in my opinion.
I think, I think it's going to be a mixed
Sadly,
bag.
but
I think
it's,
it's a mixed bag. I think there's,
yeah.
say the human capacity for love, care, and compassion is huge. I mean, we have so much, you can just look around our neighborhoods and our communities and classrooms and doctors and hospitals and nurses and people who give and care and love every day. So even though the pressure is growing, we do have the ability to adapt in ways that are generous and kind. At the same time, we have abilities to adapt in ways that are ugly and cruel. So
Yeah.
the extremes are growing.
Yeah, and then kind of turning it towards the theosophical side, what higher energetic influences are a part of all of this too. Sometimes you're stirring the pot up to get all the pollution, the mud, all of the muck up so we can take a look at it and get rid of it, and see what we need to do.
Yeah, no, I think
the chaos.
Honesty is so important
Yeah.
because we have a lot of greenwashing going on. We've got a lot of big environmental groups who are committed to the growth imperative, still trying to tinker inside of it, doing ecological things. And I understand the happy talk. I've been there.
Yeah.
I understand the need to try to be positive and not tell people the bad news. But one of the reasons we're in this condition is that we didn't tell people the good news or the bad news. We didn't tell people the bad news and then the solutions that will require restraint among our species. We just can't quite get there, especially in the United States. And remember, one of the things I put in my next report that I'm going to be discussing next year quite a bit is this layer of activity among our species, especially in the US, of modern day marketing, public relations, and advertising, and its effect on mass psychology. And how that has also deceived people or diverted people into kind of a bread and circus, or into people like me, people that care about the earth, may care about the earth, but if I tell them they have to change their lifestyle, they resent me. I understand. I mean, listen, I'm no saint here. I haven't owned a car since 81. I've been a vegetarian since 81. I don't own anything. I have a very small footprint. Irrelevant. Everything around me has been encroaching upon this planet's health and threatening it. So you can want to protect the boundary waters, but everything around the boundary waters is encroaching on it. So if we don't deal with these problems on scale, and we don't change the systems, we're not going to change the outcome, period. There is no physical mathematical way. And that's one of the things still in the US we haven't come to terms with. And the dominant commercial systems are bombarding us with diversion, deception, and denial nonstop because they want us, because we're locked into this momentum of consumption. And that's what makes people grow the GDP 2%, 3%, 4%, 6%, and champion and pat themselves on the back for this and go, yay, the economy's growing. And this is coming from people that I agree with on a whole bunch of stuff. They still champion the GDP growth. And I'm like, what? It's like suicide.
Yeah.
It's like purchasing our way right into suicide, ecocide. And that's what's happening with the measure that we're using now. So we're in a tough place. None of this is easy. I don't expect it to be an easy answer. I'm not saying this in a way that I feel like I wish I had to say it. I wish I didn't.
I really appreciate, Ken, that you live what you preach. I mean, that's pretty cool. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's great to a degree, but it has its limits because it's irrelevant that it's like I say, there's a lot of models and samples and examples out there, but nothing's meeting the scale of the problem we're facing. And that's the key. So the models and samples and examples are good. We need that if we're going to transition. But if, once again, they can get washed away, it's kind of like cancer, right? I mean, people can live a perfectly healthy lifestyle, Michael, on Earth, but for the last 80 years, we've been marinating this planet in persistent toxic poisons, indiscriminate dumping. So you can live a pristine life eat holistically, never smoke, never drink, and still get cancer on Earth.
Yeah.
And it had nothing to do with your lifestyle.
Yeah.
You know, and that's one of the the problems we're facing. We focus on the discriminant choices, but we're really diverted away from the indiscriminate choices. Just to give you an example on the garbage discussion, you may recall back in the late 60s, early 70s, I keep referencing that point because that's a tipping point on Earth. But you'll remember that's when, you may remember the Minnesota Public Interest Research Groups and the Public Interest Research Groups back then were getting bottle bills passed, right? Where you could take a bottle in, get 10 cents for it, right? And they would charge it to the company who created the bottle, Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, the general bottling industry, and so on. They hated this. They didn't want to pay for their garbage. So what did they do is they started to shift consciousness. They hired a public relations firm and they put an ad on TV. And this ad was a Native American person by the side of the road, garbage gets thrown at his feet. He turns to the camera and he's tears coming down saying, you know, don't litter, don't hurt Mother Earth or whatever. And basically that was a huge psychological shift from holding the producer of the problem, the garbage, accountable to the consumer accountable. And our society, individuals started feeling guilty about all this garbage they were creating, as if they had control over it, as if they were in the design, engineering, and manufacturing phase of this garbage. And that created a huge psychological shift and a shift, like I mentioned, from holding the companies accountable for their garbage. They handed it over to counties, then taxpayers had to pick up the tab for all this garbage and trash that was being created. That's just one example. And just to mention, the Native American man who was in that commercial was actually Sicilian. He wasn't even Native American. But the point is that this is the trouble with shifting from structural change to holding individuals accountable. That is a trick in the modern day public relations industry, psychological trick. And it worked. It worked. I went along with it too for a long time. I was culpable. I feel guilty about that, but it's true. And that's why the genuine progress indicator to me offers a important shift in a holistic way that meets the scale of the problem we're facing.
Thank you.
And that